Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Gatney, and I'm the coordinator of the CVFS webinar series. Our host today is Uttam Sharma, Research Fellow at the Center for Global Health Equity at the University of Michigan. Uttam is going to present findings from the research project titled Improving Learning, Developing Measures of Accountability, and Evaluating Their Association with Students' Gains in Achievement in Nepal. There will be a Q&A session after the presentation. We ask that you remain muted until then. During the Q&A, you may raise your hand to ask a question or use the chat. Also, please feel free to use the chat during the presentation if you have a clarifying question. We'd also like you to know that this webinar is being recorded and will be available to view from the CVFS website. The slides will also be posted there after the webinar. Go ahead, Uttam.
Yeah, thanks, Heather, for the introduction. So this work is joint work with Dirga Gimbre, Brian Rowan, and Paul Schulz. And it's great to see Brian here. In fact, this work was mostly done by Dirga, Brian, and Paul. I was involved a little later. Okay. So here is the outline for the presentation. So to put the study in proper context, first I will briefly talk about the history of school education in Nepal and Western Chitwan, where this study was conducted. After that, we will delve deeper on the completed defeat ESRC study, and we'll go over the rationale of the study design, and findings. And after that, we'll spend a few minutes going over the ongoing Web2 study and how you can access data from the parent study. So here is the overview of school education in Nepal. So historically, the education was done in religious settings in Gurukul, monasteries, and madrasas. And in 1853, the first Western model school was opened, but it was restricted to the ruling elites and their close associates. It was only after democracy was in place in Nepal in 1951 that the schools was many more schools were established. For example, in 1954, the first education plan was drafted, and at around that time, the literacy rate in Nepal was around 5%, and now it is more than 76. And then in 1961, so Nepal adopted a free and compulsory, at least in paper, primary education policy. And at that time, the schools were mostly, like almost all of the schools were community operated, and the communities themselves established the schools. And it was only in 1971 when the new education plan was introduced that the schools became centralized and the teachers were part of the central government as well. And in 1986, the government introduced privatization in national education policy. And here, so let me go over the number of schools over time in Western Chitwan, where we conduct this school. And this is the location where the CVFS sample is also drawn from. So here you can see that there were no schools in 1954. So in 1963, like in 1961, so there was this new education policy and many more schools started establishing in Nepal. So, but then after that, so the schools, the number of schools increased by a lot. So in the last 50 years, like for example, in 1963, there were only 23 public schools, 24 public schools. And in 2018, there were 93 public schools and 63 private schools. And before in 1983, there was just one private school, but after that it increased substantially, and right now there are 63 private schools. And please do feel free to interrupt me for clarification if you have any questions. And here, so we go over access to schooling and the number of students by gender in schools. So in 1963, so there were very few students enrolled in school. And two things that I want to highlight here is like initially, like the schools were predominantly male. There were many more boys than girls. Like, for example, in 1963, only 25% of the students were girls. But in 2016, 48% of the students were girls. And the other thing I want to say is that most of the dropouts that happen, so I haven't shown here, they happen after grade 8, until around grade 8, there is largely a gender parity as well. So Nepal has made impressive gains in access to schooling, but when it comes to quality of education, there is a lot to be done. For example, in a recently concluded study, more than 30% of students at the end of grade 3, those students whose mother tongue was Nepali, they couldn't even identify a simple Nepali word. So it was 30% at the end of grade 3 or beginning of grade 4 as well. And in the school living certificate exam, that is taken after grade 8, before the government instituted no failing policy. At that time, less than 50% of the students would pass the grade 10 SLC examination. That was even when the passing grade was just 32 for each subject. So now let me go over the main study, the improving learning, developing measures of accountability and evaluating their association with students gain in Nepal. This was a project funded by DFID ESRC, and the study goals were to investigate how school level accountability processes, instructional service delivery in schools, and student learning are related. In the next slides, I will discuss more about how we measure those variables. And about the study sample, as I mentioned earlier, so we've focused on Western Chitwan, and we focused on schools offering 8th grade education in 2018 and 19. And we had in Western Chitwan, in our area, so we had 114 schools, and out of those 57 were community or public schools and 57 were institutional or private schools. I think I should have mentioned this earlier. Here I use community and public to mean the same thing, and institutional and private to mean the same thing. For some reason in Nepal, the government uses institutional for private schools and community for public schools. So the sample size is 114, and then we also had 14 school management committees chairs interviewed. So the school management committees, especially in public schools, is pretty big, and they are involved in, among other things, hiring of temporary teachers, and also involved in infrastructure development in the schools. So in private schools, they're not as important as in public schools. And we also interview 114 parent teacher association chairs, head teachers, principals, 8th grade teachers, parents, and students. Overall, we have a very rich data set. So we have collected a lot of information from all these people. And let me go over the distribution of schools offered, offering grade 8. Here, the orange one shows private schools, and the blue one's public schools. And there are three stratas in this location. So the one to the right, so it's more urban areas, and in the middle is semi-urban, and to the left is more rural areas. And as you can see here, in the urban areas, there are many more private schools, and less so in the semi-urban strata too. And in more rural areas, there are fewer private schools. So as and the establishment of private schools are more in urban areas. And one thing I should have said earlier was that so in private schools, the households need to pay for their fees, and there is no financial support from the government. In fact, even during COVID, government did not provide any support to private schools. So let me briefly go over some descriptive statistics and the socioeconomic disparities and achievement as well. And so in our sample, we have close to 4,700 students, and out of that, 48% are in public schools, and 51% are 52% are in private schools. But the proportion varies greatly by ethnicities. For example, the Brahmin, Kshatriya, Newars, the privileged groups, in that group, 65% of them are of the children from those ethnicities are in private schools. But for Janjatis is 43%, and for Dalits, the least privileged group is 23%. And here, I want to go over the percentage of students in public and private schools based on wealth quintile. And in these graphs, I show the share of children in different wealth quintile enrolled in private schools. So here we see that as household wealth increases, the probability of a child being enrolled in private school increases. So 17% of the poorest quintile go to private school, while for the richest quintile, it is 82%. And one reason for some richer parents preferring public schools is there are quotas for students in public schools to study subjects such as subjects like medicine and engineering. And for the and the private schools are required to enroll some poor students as well. So that could partly explain why some people from the poorest quintile are also studying in private schools. The other reason is there are some parents, given that they feel like private schools are better than public schools, so they try very hard to enroll in private school regardless of their whether they have the means or not. And here, like we see that male child is more likely than female child to be enrolled in private schools regardless of wealth quintile. And the disparity is less for the richest quintile. So in this particular graph, we see, like, for example, among the poorest quintile, so 22% of the boys in the poorest quintile go to private schools, while only 12% of the girls in the poorest quintile go to private school. In the richest quintile, like, it's 84% for boys and 81% for girls. And now let me talk about the assessments that were conducted for this particular research. So these were low stakes assessments. That was so the research team worked closely with the Ministry of Education's Education Review Office, and it is these assessments were very similar to the standard assessments they did. I will talk about those later as well. Here, we show results from the percentage correct in math, science, and Nepali assessments by gender, and these are unadjusted means of percent of total scores in these subjects. And we do not use scaled scores here, but in our regression analysis later, we do we use scale scores there. So one thing I want to highlight here is that we don't do a systematic study, but the scores are pretty low. They're on average, they're getting less than 40% of the items correct. And this low learning is also similar in other findings from other studies as well. And having said that, so let me go over the average scores uh, uh, for male and female students. So in general, in math and science, male students do better than female students, but in Nepali, it's the opposite. Female students do better than the male students, and I do want to highlight that this finding requires nuanced interpretation. So we'll discuss more in the next slides. It likely indicates that male students have access to a more conducive educational environment, and we do find support for this finding in another setting. So we'll discuss later. And similarly, by ethnicity, we see that the most privileged group, the Brahmin, Kshatriya, and Newar students, on average, do better than Janjati and Dalit students. And the Dalit, the least privileged group, they do worse in most subjects, worse than others. But in Nepali, and their average score is similar to that of the Janjati students. And it is partly because one of the reasons is that the mother tongue of most of the Dalits is Nepali, and with Janjatis, many of them speak other language besides Nepali is their mother tongue. And here, we look at the assessment scores by wealth quintile, and it's anticipated students from more economically privileged backgrounds exhibit higher scores in all subjects. So this pattern likely indicates their access to a more conducive educational environment. In Nepali, the difference, which is in the right-hand side, so there is slightly less difference, presumably because of the value students associate to Nepali language. In For math and science, I think more value is placed for those subjects, both by the schools and the students as well. And now here, so we are focusing on assessment scores by gender for public schools and private schools separately. So if we look at the left-hand side, it is for public schools. And what we see here is that for Nepali, so female students are doing better than male students. And in science and math, in the case of public schools, male students are doing better than female students. But now, when we look at the private schools, what we see is that the female students are still doing better than male students in Nepali. But now there is a difference in science and math subjects. Here, the difference is not statistically different. So this we do feel like okay, this finding deserves more exploration, because students in private schools, presumably they have better access to educational environment, better so they can So because of that as well, we don't see as much difference. And similarly, so here we look at wealth quintile for private and public schools separately, and remarkably, assessment scores within the same type of schools show little variation based on wealth quintiles. So the scores are relatively consistent, and this also requires more exploration. So, yeah, let me just recap what I said earlier. So we have shown you that there are differences in achievement among boys and girls, students from different ethnic groups, and students coming from homes with different levels of household wealth. But then decades of research from the United States and from many other countries show that these differences in student learning exist at the very point of entry into schools, and that entry differences continue to exist as students progress through school. So for this reason, the focus has now shifted to looking at growth in learning, that is changes in test scores over time. This is because the only way to make up for differences in learning at entry into schooling is to affect growth in learning in subsequent years. So this is what we do in our regression analysis as well. So for our basic statistical model, we have two outcome or dependent variables. One is the audit or low stakes test that was developed for this particular study, and it was developed by Nepal's Education Ministry. And the other one is high stakes accountability test. So the audit test is similar to National Assessment of Student Achievement, NASA, conducted by ERO. They do it mostly every 3 years, and it's nationally representative as well. So the same team was involved in preparing the assessments for our purpose as well. And the other one is the basic education examination, and some also call it basic level examination, that is taken after grade 8 by the municipalities, the local governments in Nepal. So there are 753 local governments, so each of them have their own set of these assessments. And for our audit test, we conducted tests in math, science, and Nepali. So we collected the same information from the high stake exams as well. So we will look at both audit test and high stake tests for during in our analysis. And here is our basic statistical model. So as I mentioned earlier, so we do control for their previous achievement scores as well. Not just we just don't look at their assessment scores at one point, but we look at that particular point in the previous assessments as well. And one thing by now you may have realized that there is a sorting of students into private and public schools based on various factors such as gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. So we need to control for this, for that one. So what we do, and I will discuss more in the next slide, is that we can calculate propensity scores and then divide students into different propensity stratum, so we control for those students. And given that our data is so it's clustered at the school level, so we do use multi-level statistical model, and we have other student characteristics as well. So let me go over how we calculated the propensity score. So from interviews with students and their families, we have data on their gender, ethnicity, the parents' education level, and then parents' educational aspiration for student and household income and wealth. So based on those student characteristics, we compute a single score predicting the probability of students' enrollment into a private school. So this propensity score allowed us to control for student background. So in other words, we are trying to avoid overestimating the effect of private schools in our regression analysis. So we believe that if we didn't do this one, then we would see a higher coefficient estimate for private schools. So in other words, we would be our estimate would be biased. So we are trying to control. Yeah.
You offered to take questions during.
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and take you up on that.
That's it.
Thank you for sharing this, Brian. Great to see you. Parents' educational aspirations to predict the propensity that they attend a private school. I tell you, my aspirations are evolving as my kids' applications succeed and fail when they apply to schools. Wouldn't parental educational aspirations measured during this study be endogenous to whether the kid got internet?
So one thing, okay, so we do calculate this one during the baseline. So it is not related to the so I fully
sorry, my friend. I'm assuming that the baseline was occurred within, let's say, 3 years of whether the kid is enrolled in a private school or public school at the time of observation. My aspirations for my children are definitely affected by witnessing their performance in every grade up till 8.
Yeah, one thing we could do, and I think later on, I think Brian also may add his own insights as well. I think my guess, so we didn't try to do that, but one thing we could do is we could remove this variable and compute this propensity score. And like based on what I know, like I haven't done that one, but I'm pretty sure like the results would be similar, qualitatively similar. So I understand you. So so we can do that for our is a robustness check.
Thank you, and please don't tell any of my kids I said this. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So, is there any other questions? Or okay, let me go to the next slide then.
Oh, Utam, if I may,
Yes, sure.
I think you made the point, Bill. The pretest here is of 8th grade, post-test is spring of 8th. The measures of the parents' expectations are taken, early. Let's just put it that way, right? Early in 8th grade. So they don't measure, they're not like, they can't be affected by the outcome. The outcome is after the measurement of the aspirations. You see what I'm saying? So, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I was with you until he's using that propensity as an adjustment for whether they're in private school.
Yeah, but if it's okay, so the only way the use of a covariate in a propensity model is endogenous and is biasing your outcome is if it's in fact endogenous, that is taken in some way during or as you measure the outcome. And so we're just sort of saying, nah, we measured this before the outcome.
Yeah, I tell you, the part I disagree is you're using the propensity to make an adjustment for whether it's public or private school in the prediction of the outcome of the after school test. I'd argue if I'm with you, Brian, and I'm like, well, why adjust it all? Why not just put private and public in there? But let's let Utam finish and come back around on this kind of stuff when we get done, because the data is super cool, and I'm trying to figure out how much work do you actually have to do with it because it's so cool.
Yeah, thanks. So now, okay, we look at additional independent variables, the school characteristics, and we measure 4 types of school characteristics. The institutional status, whether it's private or public, is straightforward. It's a dichotomous variable, so that one. And then there are 3 other variables that we create. So these are external actors engagement, or which we call diversified governance, external monitoring, government supervision, and instructional quality. So what we did is we used a factor analysis to create a single scale scores for each respondent, and then factor analyze the person scale scores after aggregating to the school level. So diversified form of governance is calculated by combining parent, teacher, head teacher, SMC chair, and PTA chair responses to questions about the extent to which they participated in a wide range of school functions. And we measured external monitoring and supervision of school by asking the head teacher, SMC chair, PTA chair, teachers, and parents about the number of times the school was visited by ministry officials, government education inspectors, mayor, ward chairperson, or ward member. And for measures of instructional quality at schools, these items were drawn from tripod, also known as 7Cs, and students report on the extent to which their current teachers provided them with personal care and support for learning by captivating interest, clarifying ideas, and consolidating learning, and challenging and well managed instructional activities. So the 7Cs, we use that one to measure it, to measure the instructional quality. And here we provide the distributions of the governance and instructional quality measures across public and private school. And as expected, private schools have a lower mean on our measures of diversified governance. It is consistent with our assumption that public schools' pursuit of improved student learning is moderated in comparison to private schools. And as predicted, private schools had a lower mean on our measure of government supervision or inspection, and fewer teacher absences than did public schools, and higher student ratings of instructional quality. And here we provide the regression estimates for effects of school governance, instructional quality on student achievement. And please note that we did control for other student characteristics and the propensity score matching. So the stratum as well, those estimates are not shown here. So we have 2 types of outcome variables, the NASA, the audit test, and the high stakes, like a BE exam, BE test. So what we see, let's focus on the school type. So the private school is the coefficient is significant in math, science, and Nepali for in the case of BE, but it is only statistically significant for math in the NASA test or the low stake test. And then even then the coefficient for math is much lower than that for the PE, math, and science. And the external actors engagement and the external monitoring. In the case of external monitoring variable, none of the estimates are significant. And even in the case of external actors engagement, it is significant for in 2 cases. In the case of science for NASA, and it is and math for PE, but their coefficients are so opposite. It's a negative in one case and positive in the other one. However, when we look at the instructional quality, is significant in 5 of the 6 regression equations. So it is only it's less it's not significant in the case of Nepali for NASA, and it's significant at a 10% level for BE Nepali. And one thing I should mention here is that So many schools and parents, they focus more on subjects like math and science, and they give less value to Nepali subject as well. So in any case, we do see a more consistent result in the case of instructional quality. So there is positive association with student achievement. So let me discuss the findings here. So one thing which is our regression analysis showed statistically significant and substantially large private school effects on student achievements when high stakes BE test scores were the dependent variables. But private school effects were statistically significant in only one of the regression analysis where NASA scale scores were the dependent variable and the effect was substantially small. And the findings that private schools do not have much of an effect on achievement is contrary to the widespread view, at least in Nepal, that private schools are better at producing high achievement than public schools. However, our findings do not contradict the fact that 8th grade private school students show higher test scores than private school students at the end of 8th grade. What they show is that the gains in learning across 8th grade were about equal for the students in the study in the two types of school after we control for student characteristics. And so if we assume that private school effects on student achievement are real, we can ask why these positive effects are so much larger for the BE test than the NASA test. So one answer is the BE test serves as a market signal of school quality in Nepal. At least BE results are known by parents and others in the community, whereas the NASA one, even though it was done rigorously, and so it is it's an audit test. So that one, the test, so the items could be different. So it could be one of the reasons why we see the effect in one but not in the other. And so what are the implications of our findings? So here are next steps for policy, practice, and research that we could consider. For example, if this finding is replicated in other studies as well, then the discussion could shift from concerns with forms of control over schools, public versus private, to improve the quality, how to improve the quality of classroom instructions in school. Similarly, the education practice community could also play a role in developing instructional improvement programs for broad dissemination. And the research community could also look for good ways to measure the quality of classroom instruction in schools. And before we talk about the web to study, here are two other working papers that is currently we are currently working on using these data sets. So Anushka, Bill, and Dirga, they are working. They were working on the paper, "The Role of Restroom Quality in Academic Success." And Dirga and I are also working on how fathers' migration status influences school choice and achievement of their children. And the webinar for this paper, there was a webinar last year about this work. So let me spend a few minutes going over the ongoing follow-up web to study. So the data collection work is ongoing. It started 2 weeks ago, and we expect to complete it by January of 2024. And there are many questions that we're asking in that survey. Like, for example, we are looking at the reasons behind those who dropped out in various grades. So these students were in grade 8 in 2018, and by now, if they had continued studies, they would have just completed their grade 12, and some of them would have started undergraduate studies. So we expect some of them to drop out of school in various grades. So we want to see, okay, what are their characteristics? And we do ask a lot about the aspirations of these children, both for work and education, what they plan to do, work in, their education level and income. So what they expect income in about 10 years. And another question we ask is whether they want to go abroad for work or study, and why they want to go there, and what would have stopped them to go abroad for work or study. And from our earlier work, we realized that we needed more details on the migration history of parents. So we are collecting that information in this round. We do have COVID level disruptions and how it affected these individual youths. And we are also collecting data on use of tobacco, alcohol, and other substance use, and their use of social media. And we are trying hard to collect the data on GPAs, their grades in school education examination taken after grade 10 and after their grade 12 exam, if they have those scores. And similarly, we do on a subset of similar questions, we ask both youths and one of their parents to see how similar their scores, their responses are. So one motivation for us to to go for Web 2 was was the fact that there are limited high quality student learning data available in many panel surveys from developing countries, and studies have shown that student ability broadly defined, or the test scores do have do affect the decisions many of them take in later life. So we want to control. So we do have data both, at least two kinds of data. One from the ISTEX exam and test, and the other one from our audit test as well, so we could control for those variables. So that is one reason why we are very keen on continuing with this study. And so we are following up with more than 50% of the children who were in grade 8 in 2019, and we are selecting students from all the 114 schools. So there will be both students from both private and public schools in roughly equal numbers. And this work is exploratory in nature, in the sense that we focused on developing a broad understanding of diverse topics. So rather than delving into in-depth analysis of limited topics, we can, like, after this round, I think we can look at it and then pursue in-depth analysis, or conduct future research and topics that are more relevant. Right now, we wanted to have a broad understanding of what these youths are currently doing, and their opinions. And so as I mentioned earlier, we do have rich data. So this data can be used as a standalone, for educational research. So we do have data from students, parents, schools, head teachers, SMC school management teams, committees, parent-teacher association chairs, and on diverse topics. So it can be used for that one. The access for this one, so there is for the parent data, so you can get you have access to it from UK Data Service. The link is provided there. And then we have deposited the data at ICPSR, and the restricted data is expected to be available late 2024. And for those of us who are using CVFS data, I think it could be used as proxies for school quality, because these schools are from the CVFS locations from which CVFS sample is drawn as well. So I have, so this was my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And Brian is also here, so he can add more. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Hi, Uttam.
Hi,
Thank you for with my
hi, Nick. Yeah.
thank you for the presentation. That was really cool to see both the data set and the analysis that you've done already. I have just one contextual question. Do you know, are the private schools, I guess my question is like, are they all acting independent of each other, or is there some kind of larger organization that runs many of the private schools? And the reason I ask is just to get a sense of like, would we expect them to be correlated in terms of like how they train, children in the same way that we might expect government schools to be kind of correlated in terms of their, and I don't know if that's an assumption, but also like would the government schools be correlated in how they, the research they have and how they train children?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I don't think they are coordinated in a traditional sense. Like so, each of them is owned by separate people, and the investors are different. So, like in general, like I don't know exactly for Chitwan per se, but in Nepal that is largely the case. But then the other, in one sense, they are coordinated in the sense that there are many people who oppose private schools, so they do join forces. They do have, for example, there is the private school association, student association, private schools association, and they do fight for the common cause. In that sense, they are coordinated, but at other times, I'm pretty sure they compete for students, so they don't coordinate in that particular sense. Yeah, thanks, Nick. So, Brian, do you want to add anything that I didn't talk much, or because you have reflected on this topic, you have reflected more than me. So, are there anything you'd want to elaborate, or you want to say something that I missed? Yeah.
But I don't think we missed anything. I mean, there's just some remarkable findings. One is,
I'm
most
some
of the
trouble hearing
studies,
you.
okay, most of the studies of eighth grade achievement in Nepal have really focused on those high stakes exams. And so, it's interesting that you get really big effects of private schools on those things, but not on the audit test. And, there's some evidence that that's also occurs in the US, like you get the effects on the state tests, but never on NAEP. So, I mean, that's just interesting, and people really ought to look into that. And as far as I can tell, nobody even knows what's on those tests. Like I don't. What is on that test, that makes it have such big private school effects and the other one have. I can pretty much figure out why the low stakes assessment isn't having a lot of effects, but I can't figure out what's even on the high stakes one. So that to me is really the most interesting thing. The other thing is these governance variables that we have are really, I think, quite well measured and are having no effect, and yet there's just a ton of debate in Nepal and even around the world about governance, when in fact, our data suggest instruction is the only signal we're getting that accounts for kids' gains in achievement over eighth grade. And so, I'm a big
Brian,
fan.
thank you for going down this path, because and Uttam, thank you for mentioning the work that I did with Anushka Patel. Anushka's primary focus, Brian, is whether or not girls' bathrooms have menstrual supplies in them or not. Uttam opened up by saying that actually there's pretty good gender parity in attendance at schools through eighth grade, but not so much after there, which, raises this question to me immediately. And you know, I'm fortunate to live in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where there's menstrual supplies in every bathroom, even every bathroom I go into. But the rest of the world is kind of looking for some evidence, Brian. And I asked about these propensity scores specifically because I thought the time 1, time 2 design of these test scores was gold. And I'm scratching my head about reviewers not being satisfied that that's enough to detect whether a menstrual product in a bathroom. So Anushka finds that test scores improve in schools that have products in the bathroom. But I'm trying to figure out, you know, what else do I have to adjust for to convince reviewers? Or Brian, I'm open to hearing your advice. I tried to go to population studies type of journals, not to education type of journals, because that's audience I want to influence. But you know, am I thinking about the wrong journals? I saw this propensity score thing and my ears perked up because I'm like, okay, yes, we've got a lot of other data we could throw at these things, but then it does lead you down this path of, well, wait a second, how much are you controlling for if, you know, I went to Anushka and said, just run it separate for private and public. Why are we doing this? You know, I don't know. What is the gold standard, my friend, in what we got to do to convince something that X affects Y?
Well, I mean, do an experiment, obviously, but in this
Yeah, I can't do that, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't do an experiment. So you're stuck with some kind of way of. I think two things would bother me here. One would be not controlling for the probability that a girl is exposed to the treatment, right? So I don't know which kinds of schools and which kinds of kids. So, you know, and how you do that is up to debate, but, you know, I think you need to at least control for probability of being exposed to the treatment and compare only among like students with like probabilities. That's one. And two is, you know, it strikes me that the presence of these menstrual products in schools could be some kind of a weird indicator of general school quality.
Yeah, totally possible.
Yeah,
And it's felt like you guys measured so many things.
Yeah, you know, we got a bunch of stuff in there, but you know, one thing it could be is a measure of how much the school cares about the kids, pays attention to the kids, stuff like that. So you might want to try to enunciate the causal mechanisms through which this treatment actually is having effects. So if I were going to spend some time with it, that's how I would go. I'd say, well, okay, well, what is it about that treatment that is actually causing kids to learn more?
Yeah, it's interesting,
right?
Brian.
That's so, to learn more.
Not my area of expertise. Anushka's not with us today. She did a lot of looking. There's, in my view, not nearly enough written about these topics, but you know, the most clear is if a girl's menstruating and feels like she can't be in the school, she's gonna miss a whole bunch of days. Sorry, you're on mute. But
you know, you could always just check that out, you know, see whether that's true and whether that process, the number of days you're present, because I'm pretty sure we have the kids.
No, there's a lot of kids who we had to do a lot of work. There's a lot of kids missing a lot of days, no doubt about that.
Yeah, no doubt. Right, right. You know, the other thing you got to remember here is that, man, you know, these gains are being measured over a tiny portion of time, so they're really, you know,
I was surprised we found anything, honestly. Like,
no,
I mean, thought, you know, that would
pretty amazing, but there's a ton of power. There's a ton of power. So
yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. And if anybody else who heard this has ideas, I'm all ears.
Well, thank you very much, Uttam. Oh, did you want to?
I think Brian wanted.
Yeah, just have one question for you, Tom. So you got these kids who are leaving the schools that we studied. You're taking a 50% chance sample and then you're following up. Are you following up with any kid, whether or not that kid is enrolled in a school?
Yeah, anyone like.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
one thing I might just look at in this case,
Yeah, the only
It-
constraint we had was, I think one thing we did was only for those we had baseline, at least one baseline space course. Yeah,
yeah. But you know, what I would be looking at instead of grades,
yeah,
because you're going to lose a bunch of kids who drop out, is being enrolled.
yeah,
That's the big variable here is, I mean, you know, you can get into the thing, but you're losing power left and right and not even able probably to calculate school effects. So, but you know, whether or not a kid is enrolled or not enrolled in school is probably going to have big effects on what we're talking
sure.
about. And so you're controlling for all those personal characteristics that are dictating enrollment and trying to figure out what the effects are of being enrolled. That I really would like to see.
Yeah. So we'll definitely contact you once we get the data because yeah, we do want to hear a lot from you. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, thank you so much,
thank you.
Tom. Really appreciate the presentation.
Yeah, thanks. Thank
Good day.
Thank you.
you. Thank you.